The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The extraction point was supposed to be clear by now, but the radio had been silent for over an hour. Something was wrong. "Chief, we've got movement on the ridge line," whispered Petty Officer Jake Morrison, his voice barely audible through the comms. The Navy SEAL team had been conducting reconnaissance on a high-value target for 3 days, and now they were supposed to be heading home. Chief Petty Officer David Tank Williams lowered his binoculars and studied the terrain ahead. 8 years of combat experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being was screaming danger. The extraction zone that had been designated as secure was crawling with enemy fighters. "Count them," Tank ordered, his voice steady despite the growing tension in his chest. Morrison adjusted his scope and began the methodical process of identifying targets. "I've got 15 armed combatants. Looks like they're setting up positions around our LZ." The landing zone was a small clearing about 200 meters down the slope, surrounded by rocky outcroppings that provided perfect cover for an ambush. It was supposed to be their ticket home, but now it looked more like a death trap. Rodriguez felt his stomach tighten. They were a 4-man team, deep in enemy territory, with limited ammunition and no backup plan. The original mission had been straightforward: gather intelligence on a Taliban commander's compound, and report back. They had done their job, but now the easy part was over. "Base, this is Alpha Team," Tank spoke into his radio, keeping his voice low. "LZ is compromised. Request alternate extraction point. Over." Static filled their earpieces. Tank tried again, adjusting the frequency. Still nothing. "Equipment failure?" asked Morrison, though they all knew the radio had been working fine just an hour ago. Tank shook his head grimly. "No, someone doesn't want us talking to base." The fourth member of their team, Hospital Corpsman Second Class Amy Chun, had been monitoring enemy radio chatter on her specialized equipment. Her face was pale as she looked up from her device. "Chief, you need to hear this," she said, offering him the headset. Tank listened for several minutes, his expression growing darker with each passing second. The conversation was in Pashto, but Chun had been translating the key points. What he heard made his blood run cold. The Taliban had known they were coming. Worse, they knew exactly where the extraction point would be and when. This wasn't just bad luck or poor operational security. This was a setup. "They're talking about 4 American soldiers," Chun continued. "They know our team size, our approximate location, and they've been tracking us since yesterday." Morrison cursed under his breath. How is that possible? Our mission was classified at the highest levels. Tank was already thinking through their options, none of which were good. They were 8 miles from the nearest friendly forces, surrounded by hostile territory, with an enemy that seemed to know their every move. The mountains offered some concealment, but they also limited their mobility and escape routes. "New plan," Tank announced. "We move to higher ground and try to establish contact with base from a better position. If someone's jamming our comms, we need to get above their interference." The team began packing their equipment with practiced efficiency. Every movement was deliberate and silent, honed by countless hours of training and months of combat experience. They had worked together for over a year, and their coordination was seamless. As they prepared to move, Rodriguez spotted something that made his heart sink. "Chief, we've got vehicles approaching the LZ. Looks like technicals." Through his binoculars, Tank could see 3 pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns racing toward their original extraction point. The dust clouds they kicked up were visible from miles away, and it was clear they weren't trying to be subtle about their approach. "How many men in those trucks?" Tank asked. "At least 20, probably more," Rodriguez replied. "And they're not local militia. These guys are moving with purpose." Chun had been listening to more radio chatter, and her face had gone from pale to ashen. "Chief, there's something else. They're talking about a reward. Someone's put a bounty on our heads." The implications were staggering. Not only had their mission been compromised, but now they were being actively hunted by an enemy that had significant resources and inside information. Tank made a decision that would save their lives, at least temporarily. "We're moving to the North Ridge. It'll give us better cover and a view of the entire valley. Maybe we can figure out what we're really dealing with." The climb was steep and treacherous, but it was better than staying in the open. Each man carried over 60 pounds of equipment, and the thin mountain air made every step a challenge. They moved in single file, with Morrison taking point and Rodriguez covering their rear. After 2 hours of climbing, they reached a position that offered both concealment and a commanding view of the area below. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. The enemy forces weren't just random Taliban fighters. They were well-equipped, well-coordinated, and following a specific plan. Roadblocks had been set up on all the major routes out of the valley, and patrols were systematically searching the areas where the SEAL team might seek shelter. "This is professional," Tank observed. "Someone's running this operation who knows how we think and how we operate." Morrison was studying the enemy positions through his scope when he noticed something that made him freeze. "Chief, look at the guy in the command vehicle. The one with the radio." Tank adjusted his binoculars and focused on the figure Morrison had identified. The man was wearing military-style clothing, but something about his posture and the way he carried himself seemed familiar. "Son of a bitch," Tank whispered. "That's Ahmad Nazir." The name sent a chill through the entire team. Ahmad Nazir was a former Afghan army captain who had defected to the Taliban 2 years earlier. More importantly, he had been present during several joint operations with U.S. forces before his defection. He knew American tactics, equipment, and procedures. "That explains how they knew about our mission," Chun said grimly. "Nazir has inside knowledge of how we operate." But there was something even more troubling about Nazir's presence. He shouldn't have been in this area at all. Intelligence reports had placed him over 100 miles away, operating with a different Taliban cell. His appearance here suggested a level of planning and coordination that went beyond a simple ambush. "Rodriguez, check your GPS," Tank ordered. "I want to know exactly where we are and what the nearest alternative extraction points might be." Rodriguez pulled out his handheld GPS device and frowned at the display. "Chief, this doesn't make sense. According to this, we're about 3 miles from where we should be. Equipment malfunction?" "No, sir. I've been checking our position regularly. We're exactly where we plan to be. But the GPS is showing coordinates that are way off." Tank felt a cold realization wash over him. Someone had been feeding them false information from the beginning. Their mission coordinates, their extraction point, probably even their target intelligence had been compromised. "We're not just dealing with a leak," he said quietly. "Someone on our side is actively working against us." The team spent the next hour observing enemy movements and trying to piece together the scope of the betrayal. What they discovered was even worse than they had imagined. The Taliban forces weren't just waiting at their extraction point. They had set up a network of positions that covered every possible escape route the SEAL team might use. It was as if someone had given them a complete copy of the team's standard operating procedures. As the afternoon wore on, Tank made the difficult decision to break radio silence and attempt contact with their command structure. If they were going to survive, they needed to know who they could trust. "Base, this is Alpha Team," he transmitted on an emergency frequency. "We are compromised and require immediate extraction. Our primary LZ is hostile." The response came back almost immediately, but it wasn't what they expected. "Alpha Team, this is Base. You are ordered to proceed to your designated extraction point as planned. No deviations from mission parameters are authorized." Tank stared at the radio in disbelief. Either their command didn't understand the situation, or someone was deliberately sending them into a trap. "Base, be advised, our LZ is occupied by hostile forces. Request alternate extraction procedures." "Alpha Team, your orders stand. Proceed to extraction point Echo 7 as planned." "Base out." The radio went silent, leaving the 4 SEALs to contemplate their impossible situation. Their own command was ordering them to walk into what was obviously an ambush, and they had no way of knowing who they could trust. "What do we do now, Chief?" Morrison asked. Tank looked at each member of his team. These were some of the most highly trained soldiers in the world, and they were trapped by their own command structure as much as by the enemy. "We survive," he said simply, "and we figure out who's trying to kill us." As the sun began to set over the Afghan mountains, the 4 SEALs prepared for what might be their final mission. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and apparently abandoned by their own command. But they were still alive, and as long as they drew breath, they would fight. What they didn't know was that help was already on the way, in the form of a pilot who had been listening to their radio transmissions and was about to make a decision that would change everything. High above the clouds, Major Sarah Ghost Patterson was flying a routine patrol mission in her A-10 Thunderbolt when she intercepted the SEAL team's emergency transmissions. What she heard made her blood boil, and what she decided to do about it would put her own career and life on the line. The abandoned SEALs were about to discover that sometimes the best help comes from the most unexpected places, and that true courage means standing up for what's right, even when the entire system is working against you. But first, they had to survive the night. Major Sarah Ghost Patterson had been flying combat missions for 8 years, but she had never heard anything like the radio transmissions crackling through her headset. 30,000 feet above the Afghan mountains, her A-10 Thunderbolt was supposed to be conducting a routine patrol along the Pakistani border. Instead, she found herself listening to what sounded like a death sentence being handed down to 4 American soldiers. The call sign Alpha Team had been broadcasting on emergency frequencies for the past hour, and their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah had initially planned to ignore the transmissions and stick to her assigned patrol route, but something about the desperation in the team leader's voice made her listen more carefully. "Base, this is Alpha Team requesting immediate extraction. We are surrounded and taking heavy fire." The response from their command post was cold and bureaucratic. "Alpha Team, maintain radio silence. You are ordered to proceed to extraction point Echo 7 as planned." Sarah felt her jaw clench. She had heard enough military double talk in her career to recognize it when she heard it. Someone was deliberately sending those soldiers into a trap. She checked her fuel levels and calculated how long she could loiter in the area. Her A-10 was loaded with a full complement of 30mm rounds and Maverick missiles, more than enough firepower to level a small city. The problem wasn't her capabilities, it was her orders. The no-fly order had come down from the highest levels just 2 hours ago. All air support operations in the Alpha Team's area of operations were suspended pending a review of operational security. Sarah knew what that meant in military speak. Someone important was covering their ass, and the soldiers on the ground were expendable. But Sarah Patterson hadn't become one of the most feared close air support pilots in the Air Force by following orders that got good people killed. She had earned her call sign Ghost because she had a reputation for appearing out of nowhere when ground troops needed her most, often in defiance of strict rules of engagement. She banked her aircraft toward the coordinates she had triangulated from the SEAL team's transmissions. If she was going to help them, she needed to understand exactly what they were facing. Meanwhile, on the ground, Tank Williams was trying to keep his team alive through their first night in hell. The Taliban forces had been probing their positions since sunset, testing their defenses and trying to determine their exact location. "Movement at 2 o'clock. Morrison whispered into his headset. "Looks like a scouting party." Tank peered through his night vision scope and counted at least 6 figures moving carefully through the rocks below their position. They were good, but not good enough to fool operators with years of experience in this exact type of terrain. "Hold position," Tank ordered. "Let them pass. We don't want to give away our location unless we have no choice." Chun was monitoring enemy radio traffic, and what she was hearing painted a grim picture of their situation. "Chief, they brought in reinforcements. I'm counting at least 4 different units coordinating the search. They're planning to squeeze us from multiple directions." Rodriguez was studying their tactical map by the dim light of a red-filtered flashlight. "We've got maybe 12 hours before they tighten the noose completely. After that, we'll be lucky to find a place to make our last stand." The reality of their situation was becoming increasingly clear. There were 4 highly trained soldiers against an estimated 80 enemy fighters who knew the terrain and had unlimited time to hunt them down. Even if they had been at full strength with proper support, those odds would have been challenging. But what made their situation truly desperate was the growing certainty that someone on their own side wanted them dead. Tank had been in enough classified operations to understand how the system worked. The sudden communication blackout, the insistence on using a compromised extraction point, and the convenient suspension of air support all pointed to a deliberate effort to eliminate his team. "Chun, I need you to try something," Tank said quietly. "See if you can reach any aircraft on guard frequencies. Don't identify us as Alpha Team. Just put out a general distress call and see who responds." Chun adjusted her radio and began transmitting on the emergency frequency used by all military aircraft in the region. Any station, this is Bravo 79 requesting immediate assistance. For personnel in distress, grid coordinates follow." For several minutes, there was only static. Then, a voice came through that was different from all the others they had heard that day. It was calm, professional, and distinctly female. "Bravo 79, this is Ghost 11. I copy your distress call. What is your situation? Chun looked at Tank, who nodded. Ghost 1-1, we are 4 U.S. personnel, surrounded by hostile forces. We have wounded and are critically low on ammunition. Request immediate air support. There was a pause before the pilot responded. Bravo 79, be advised I am currently under no-fly orders for your area. Can you authenticate your unit designation? Tank took the handset from Chun. He knew he was taking a huge risk by breaking operational security, but they were already as good as dead if they followed standard procedures. Ghost 1-1, this is Chief Williams, Alpha Team. We've been abandoned by our command and are facing imminent overrun. I don't know who you are, but if you're American, we need your help. High above, Sarah Patterson felt her heart rate spike. She had flown support for SEAL teams before, and she knew these weren't regular infantry soldiers calling for help. These were some of America's most elite warriors, and someone was hanging them out to dry. Alpha Team, this is Ghost. I copy your situation. Be advised, I have significant ordnance on board, but I'm under strict orders not to engage in your area. Can you provide details on the no-fly order? Tank's response was immediate and bitter. Ghost, we were never informed of any no-fly order. Our command is still ordering us to proceed to a compromised extraction point. Someone wants us dead, and they're using the system to do it. Sarah had heard enough. She checked her instruments and began a descent toward the coordinates Alpha Team had provided. What she was about to do would probably end her career, but she hadn't joined the Air Force to watch American soldiers die because of political games. Alpha Team, this is Ghost. I'm going to need you to mark your position with infrared strobes. I'm coming down to take a look. Ghost, be advised, this will put you in direct violation of your orders, Tank warned. Chief, I've been in violation of stupid orders before. It's worked out pretty well so far. As Sarah brought her A-10 down to a lower altitude, she could see the scope of the enemy operation below. Using her aircraft's advanced targeting systems, she counted over 70 heat signatures moving in coordinated patterns around the mountainside where Alpha Team was trapped. What she saw next made her blood run cold. The Taliban forces weren't just surrounding the SEALs. They were setting up what looked like a professional military operation complete with command posts, supply lines, and coordinated communication systems. Alpha Team, Ghost. You weren't kidding about being surrounded. I'm seeing a full-scale operation down there. This isn't random Taliban activity. Someone organized this specifically to take you out. Tank's voice came back grim but determined. Ghost, can you see a way out for us? Sarah studied the terrain through her targeting system. The mountains offered natural concealment, but they also limited escape routes. The enemy had positioned themselves to control all the obvious paths down from the ridge where Alpha Team was hiding. Negative on easy routes, she transmitted, but I might be able to create some opportunities if you're willing to trust a pilot who's about to become very popular with the court-martial board. Ghost, what are you thinking? Sarah was already arming her weapons systems and calculating attack runs. I'm thinking someone needs to even the odds down there. Give me 5 minutes to thin out the crowd, then be ready to move on my signal. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for years to come. Sarah Patterson began a series of attack runs that demonstrated why the A-10 Thunderbolt was the most feared aircraft in the ground support inventory. Her first pass targeted the command vehicles that had been coordinating the enemy's search. The 30mm cannon on her aircraft fired at a rate of nearly 4,000 rounds per minute, and the depleted uranium rounds could penetrate armor like it was tissue paper. The results were immediate and spectacular. 3 pickup trucks exploded in balls of flame, and the carefully coordinated enemy operation suddenly became a confused mass of fighters running for cover. Alpha Team, this is Ghost. Execute movement to the North Ridge on my signal. I'm going to clear you a path. Tank didn't need to be told twice. All units, prepare to move. Chun, Rodriguez, you're with me. Morrison, you've got Overwatch. Sarah's second attack run focused on the heavy weapons positions that had been set up to prevent exactly the kind of movement Alpha Team was about to attempt. Her Maverick missiles found their targets with precision that came from years of experience and hundreds of hours of training. Goes to Alpha Team, execute, execute, execute. The 4 SEALs moved with the fluid coordination that marked them as elite operators. They had worked together long enough to anticipate each other's movements, and they covered the dangerous ground with a speed that bordered on superhuman. But even with their support, they weren't going to make it far without a plan. The enemy forces were already adapting to the air attacks, and Sarah's ammunition wouldn't last forever. Alpha Team, you've got maybe 10 minutes before they reorganize, Sarah transmitted. Where do you want me to put you? Tank was thinking fast as his team bounded from cover to cover. They needed a defensible position where they could hold out until proper extraction could be arranged, assuming proper extraction was even possible. Ghost, there's a compound about 2 clicks north of our position. Looks like it might be abandoned. Sarah checked her targeting system and located the structure Tank was referring to. It was a small walled compound that appeared to be some kind of agricultural facility. More importantly, it offered good fields of fire and multiple escape routes. I see it, Alpha Team. That might work, but you'll have to cross about half a mile of open ground to get there. Can you keep their heads down while we make the run? Chief, for you guys, I'll keep their heads down until my guns melt. What followed was 15 minutes of the most intense close air support action of Sarah Patterson's career. She flew repeated attack runs, using every weapon in her arsenal to keep the enemy forces scattered and unable to organize an effective pursuit of the escaping SEALs. By the time Alpha Team reached the abandoned compound, Sarah had expended most of her ammunition and was running dangerously low on fuel. But the SEALs were alive and in a position where they could defend themselves, at least temporarily. Alpha Team, this is Ghost, Sarah transmitted as she climbed back to a safer altitude. You should be good for a while, but I need to return to base for fuel and ammunition. I'll be back as soon as possible. Tank's response was filled with emotion that he rarely allowed himself to show. Ghost, I don't know who you are, but you just saved 4 American lives. We won't forget this. Chief, just stay alive until I get back. We're going to figure out who's behind this and make sure you get home. As Sarah turned her aircraft toward her base, she knew she was flying into a storm that would make the enemy fire she had just faced look like a gentle breeze. By now, her violation of the no-fly order would have been reported up the chain of command, and there would be serious consequences waiting for her. But she also knew she had done the right thing. 4 American soldiers were alive because she had chosen to follow her conscience instead of following orders that made no sense. What she didn't know was that her actions had already attracted the attention of people much higher up the chain of command, and that the conspiracy against Alpha Team went deeper than any of them had imagined. The war was far from over, and the most dangerous battles were yet to come. Colonel James Mitchell was waiting on the tarmac when Sarah Patterson's A-10 touched down at Bagram Airfield. His face was a mask of controlled fury, and the 2 military police officers flanking him made it clear that this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. Sarah shut down her engines and climbed out of the cockpit, her flight suit still damp with sweat from the intense combat mission she had just completed. She had known this moment would come, but seeing the welcoming committee made the reality hit home. Major Patterson, you are under arrest for disobeying direct orders, violation of established no-fly zones, and unauthorized engagement with hostile forces, Colonel Mitchell announced as soon as she was within earshot. Sarah removed her helmet and looked directly at her commanding officer. Sir, 4 American soldiers are alive because of those violations. I'd do it again. That's exactly the attitude that's going to get you court-martialed, Mitchell replied coldly. You had direct orders to avoid that area. Those orders came from the highest levels of command. As the military police moved to escort Sarah to detention, she made one last attempt to get through to her commander. Sir, those soldiers were deliberately being sent into an ambush. Someone is using our own command structure to get them killed. Mitchell's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Major, you are not to discuss the details of this mission with anyone. That's a direct order. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Sarah replied, but she was already thinking about ways around that order. Back at the abandoned compound, Tank Williams was setting up defensive positions and trying to figure out their next move. The air support from Ghost had bought them time, but it had also escalated their situation dramatically. Now the enemy knew they had air support, which meant the response was going to be much larger and more coordinated. Chin, what are you picking up on the radio traffic? Tank asked as he checked the magazines in his rifle. Chin's face was grave as she monitored enemy communications. It's bad, Chief. They're calling in reinforcements from 3 different provinces. I'm hearing talk about heavy weapons, maybe even some kind of artillery. Morrison was examining the compound's defenses, looking for ways to strengthen their position. This place is better than being on the open mountain, but it won't hold against a serious assault. We got maybe 6 hours before they can organize something we can't handle. Rodriguez had been working on their communication equipment, trying to establish contact with anyone in the American command structure who might be willing to help them. Chief, I've been monitoring all the frequencies, and there's something weird going on. What kind of weird? Tank asked. Our call sign has been marked as Kia in the system. According to the official records, Alpha Team was killed in action 6 hours ago. The implications hit all of them simultaneously. If they were officially dead, then no one would be looking for them, no rescue mission would be authorized, and anyone who tried to help them would be acting outside official channels. Someone's trying to erase us, Chin said quietly. Make it look like we died in the original mission. Tank felt a cold anger building in his chest. He had dedicated his life to serving his country, and now it appeared that someone within his own government was actively trying to kill him and his team. But anger wasn't going to keep them alive. New plan, he announced. We assume we're on our own from here on out. No official support, no backup, no extraction. We figure out who's behind this, and we make them pay. What do we do that from here? Morrison asked. We start by staying alive long enough for Ghost to get back. That pilot risked her career to help us, which means she's either crazy or she knows something we don't. Meanwhile, at Bagram Airfield, Sarah Patterson was being held in a detention facility pending a formal hearing. She had been stripped of her flight status and was facing charges that could result in decades in prison. But she wasn't giving up. During her one permitted phone call, she contacted someone who could help her in ways the military never could. Captain Lisa Rodriguez was an Air Force lawyer, but more importantly, she was Sarah's sister-in-law and someone who understood that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. Lisa, I need your help, Sarah said as soon as the call connected. I'm in serious trouble, but there's something bigger going on here. Sarah, what have you done? Lisa asked, though she could hear the urgency in Sarah's voice. I saved 4 American soldiers who were being deliberately sacrificed by someone in our own command structure. Now I'm facing court-martial, and those soldiers are still out there with no official support. Lisa Rodriguez had been a military lawyer long enough to recognize the signs of a cover-up. Sarah, I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you believe American soldiers are in danger because of actions taken by American commanders? Yes, Sarah replied without hesitation. Then we need to get you out of there and figure out what's really going on. What Lisa Rodriguez did next demonstrated why she had never lost a case in 5 years of military law practice. She immediately filed a series of legal motions that would tie up the charges against Sarah for weeks, giving them time to investigate the larger conspiracy. But more importantly, she began making phone calls to contacts in Washington who specialized in dealing with situations where the normal chain of command had been compromised. Back in the Afghan mountains, Alpha Team was preparing for what they knew would be a difficult night. The enemy forces were regrouping, and aerial reconnaissance had shown them massing for what looked like a major assault. We need to talk about extraction options, Tank said as his team gathered for a planning session. What extraction options? Morrison asked grimly. We're officially dead, remember? Should have been thinking about their situation from a different angle. Chief, what if we turn this around? Instead of waiting for them to attack us, what if we go after the people who set us up? Tank looked at her with interest. What are you thinking? I've been analyzing the radio intercepts from the past 2 days. There's a pattern in the communications that suggests someone is coordinating between the Taliban forces and whoever's feeding them information from our side. Rodriguez pulled out his map and spread it on the ground. If we can identify the communication hub they're using, we might be able to capture some intelligence that proves what's happening. Tank studied the map and began to see possibilities he hadn't considered before. They were trained for offensive operations, not just defensive ones. Instead of waiting to be killed, they could take the fight to their enemies. It's risky, he said slowly. We'd be going deeper into enemy territory with no support. Chief, we're going to die here anyway if we just wait, Morrison pointed out. At least this way we might be able to take some of them with us, and maybe get the evidence we need to expose whoever's behind this. Tank made the decision that would define the rest of their mission. All right, we go on the offensive. Chun, I need you to identify their primary communication site. Rodriguez, plot us a route that keeps us off the main roads. Morrison, figure out what equipment we can carry and what we'll have to leave behind. As Alpha Team prepared for their counterattack, they had no way of knowing that help was already on the way. Sarah Patterson might have been detained, but her sister-in-law had connections that reached into the highest levels of government. Lisa Rodriguez's phone calls had reached the desk of Deputy Secretary of Defense Michael Harper, a man who had built his career on rooting out corruption within the military. When he heard about the situation with Alpha Team, he immediately ordered an investigation that bypassed the normal chain of command. "Give me everything on this Alpha Team mission," Harper told his aide, "and I want to know why there was a no-fly order issued for their area of operations." The investigation that followed would uncover a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the military command structure. But while the politicians and lawyers worked in Washington, 4 soldiers in Afghanistan were fighting for their lives with nothing but their training, their equipment, and their determination to expose the truth. The communication site Chun had identified was located in a small village about 5 miles from their compound. According to the radio intercepts, it was being used to coordinate between the Taliban forces and their American contact. If they could capture the site and the personnel running it, they might be able to get the evidence they needed. But first, they had to get there alive. The journey began just after midnight, with Alpha Team moving through terrain that was crawling with enemy patrols. They had cached most of their heavy equipment, keeping only what they needed for a fast-moving assault operation. Tank led the way, using his years of experience to navigate through the mountains without detection. Every step was calculated, every movement planned to minimize their exposure to enemy observation. After 3 hours of careful movement, they reached an observation position overlooking their target. What they saw confirmed their worst fears and gave them new hope at the same time. The communication site was more sophisticated than they had expected. It wasn't just a simple radio relay. It was a full intelligence coordination center with satellite communication equipment and multiple operators working around the clock. But more importantly, they could see American-made equipment and what appeared to be a man in American military clothing working alongside the Taliban operators. "That son of a bitch," Morrison whispered as he studied the figure through his scope. "He's wearing our uniform." Tank felt his anger reach a new level, but he forced himself to remain calm. They needed this man alive if they were going to expose the conspiracy. "New objective," he announced quietly. "We take that facility intact, and we capture everyone in it. This is our chance to get the proof we need." The assault on the communication facility would be the most important mission of Alpha Team's career. Success would mean exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the American military. Failure would mean their deaths would be meaningless, and the people responsible would never face justice. As they prepared for the attack, Tank couldn't help but think about the pilot who had risked everything to save them. Ghost had shown them that there were still people in the system willing to do the right thing, even when it cost them everything. Now, it was Alpha Team's turn to prove that some principles were worth dying for. The assault began at dawn, with synchronized precision that would have made their instructors proud. But what they discovered inside the communication facility would shake their faith in everything they had believed about their mission and their country. The assault on the communication facility lasted exactly 17 minutes. Alpha Team moved with the precision of a surgical instrument, each member playing their role in a coordinated attack that had been drilled into them through countless hours of training. Morrison provided overwatch from a position on the ridge above the compound, his sniper rifle ready to eliminate any threats that emerged. Chun and Rodriguez approached from the east and west respectively, using the pre-dawn darkness to get within striking distance of the guards. Tank took the direct approach, moving straight toward the main building where the communication equipment was housed. His job was to capture the American operative they had identified and secure any intelligence that could prove the conspiracy against them. The first guard never knew what hit him. Rodriguez's knife found its mark silently, and the sentry dropped without making a sound. Chun disabled the second guard with equal efficiency, using techniques that left the man unconscious but alive for interrogation. Tank reached the main building just as the first alarm was sounded. Someone inside had noticed that the perimeter guards weren't responding to radio checks, but by then it was too late. Tank kicked in the door and found himself face to face with a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The American operative was sitting at a communication console, calmly destroying files while speaking into a headset in perfect Pashto. "Colonel Bradley Thompson, United States Army Intelligence," Tank announced, reading the name tag on the man's uniform. "You're under arrest for treason." Thompson looked up without any apparent concern. He was a man in his early 50s with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that came from years of covert operations. When he spoke, his voice was steady and professional. Chief Williams, I've been expecting you. Though I have to admit, I thought you'd be dead by now. Tank felt his blood turn to ice. This man knew who he was, knew his name and rank. The conspiracy was even deeper than they had imagined. Who are you working for? Tank demanded, keeping his weapon trained on Thompson. The same people you work for, Chief. The difference is I know who they really are. Before Tank could respond, Chin's voice crackled through his earpiece. Chief, we've got vehicles approaching from the south. Looks like American Humvees. Tank felt a moment of hope. Maybe backup had finally arrived. But Thompson's smile told him otherwise. Those aren't your friends, Chief. Those are cleanup crew. They're here to make sure there are no witnesses to what you've discovered. Tank realized they had walked into another trap. The assault on the communication facility had been expected, and now they were about to be caught between enemy forces and what appeared to be American troops working with the conspiracy. Rodriguez, Morrison, extract immediately. Tank ordered into his radio. This is a trap. But it was too late. The approaching vehicles had already surrounded the compound, and Tank could hear American voices shouting orders outside. They were trapped with nowhere to run. Thompson stood up slowly, his hands visible but showing no fear. Chief, you and your team have stumbled into something much bigger than a simple betrayal. This operation has been years in the making, and you're just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. What are you talking about? The war in Afghanistan has been very profitable for certain people, Chief. But peace negotiations have been making progress, and peace is bad for business. Your mission was designed to sabotage those negotiations by providing evidence of continued Taliban aggression. Tank felt sick as the implications became clear. You're saying we were sent here to die, so someone could use our deaths to justify continuing the war? Your deaths, and the deaths of the Afghan civilians who would have been killed in the retaliatory strikes that followed. Nothing sells weapons like a good atrocity story. Outside, Tank could hear the American voices getting closer. But something was wrong with the tactical situation. If these were legitimate American forces, they would have identified themselves and demanded surrender. Instead, he was hearing the kind of movement patterns that suggested they were preparing for an assault. Chun, Rodriguez, status report. He called the news radio. Chief, these aren't regular army, Chun responded. They're moving like contractors, and their equipment doesn't match standard issue. Tank understood. The cleanup crew Thompson had mentioned weren't official military personnel. They were private contractors, mercenaries who could kill American soldiers without triggering the kind of investigation that would expose the conspiracy. All units, prepare for contact, Tank ordered. Rules of engagement are weapons-free. These are hostile forces. Thompson was still smiling. Chief, you can fight them if you want, but you're not getting out of here alive. Too many important people have too much invested in this operation. Tank was about to respond when Morrison's voice cut through the radio chatter. Chief, we've got air support incoming. Looks like our friend Ghost is back. High above the compound, Sarah Patterson was flying her second unauthorized mission of the week. She had managed to convince the ground crew to fuel and arm her aircraft by claiming she had received emergency orders that hadn't been processed through normal channels yet. It wasn't technically a lie. The emergency was real, even if the orders were completely fabricated. Lisa Rodriguez's investigation had moved faster than anyone expected. The Deputy Secretary of Defense had authorized a classified operation to extract Alpha Team and gather evidence of the conspiracy. Sarah's mission was now official, even if most of the chain of command didn't know it yet. Alpha Team, this is Ghost, Sarah transmitted as she approached the compound. I've got authority to provide close air support. What's your situation? Tank's voice came back tight with stress. Ghost, we've got American contractors surrounding our position. They're here to eliminate witnesses. We need immediate extraction. Sarah could see the tactical situation developing below. The compound was surrounded by vehicles that appeared to be American, but their positioning and movement suggested hostile intent. More importantly, she could see Alpha Team's infrared strobes marking their position inside the main building. Alpha Team, I need you to mark the hostile positions. I can't engage American personnel without positive identification of hostile intent. Tank understood what she was asking. In order for Sarah to provide air support, he needed to provoke the contractors into revealing their true intentions. Ghost, stand by for confirmation of hostile intent. Tank turned to Thompson, who was still standing calmly by the communication equipment. Colonel, you have one chance to call off your cleanup crew and surrender peacefully. Thompson's response was to pull a pistol from his jacket and fired 2 shots at Tank, who dove behind a desk as the bullets shattered equipment around him. "All units, we are taking fire from American personnel," Tank transmitted. "Repeat, Americans are shooting at Americans. This is confirmed hostile action." That was all Sarah needed to hear. The contractors outside had revealed themselves as enemies by attempting to eliminate American soldiers. Her rules of engagement were clear. Alpha Team, get down and stay down. Danger close air support incoming. What followed was a masterpiece of precision flying. Sarah's A-10 came in low and fast, using its 30mm cannon to disable the vehicles surrounding the compound without causing casualties. Her goal wasn't to kill the contractors, but to scatter them and give Alpha Team a chance to escape. The plan worked perfectly. The contractors, faced with air support they hadn't expected, abandoned their vehicles and took cover in the surrounding terrain. In the confusion, Alpha Team was able to extract from the main building and move to a position where Sarah could provide covering fire for their escape. But Thompson wasn't finished. As Tank and his team moved toward their extraction point, the rogue colonel activated a satellite communication system and began transmitting coordinates. All stations, this is Phoenix Control," Thompson spoke into the headset. "Alpha Team has been compromised. Recommend immediate implementation of Blackout Protocol." Tank didn't know what Blackout Protocol meant, but the urgency in Thompson's voice suggested it wasn't good for their survival prospects. "Ghost, we need extraction now," Tank transmitted as his team reached the designated pickup zone. "Alpha Team, extraction is not possible at this time," Sarah responded. "I'm being ordered to return to base immediately. New orders are coming down from the highest levels." Tank felt his heart sink. Once again, just when salvation appeared to be within reach, the system was pulling it away from them. But Sarah Patterson had become very good at interpreting orders creatively. "Alpha Team, I am required to return to base, but I am authorized to conduct aerial reconnaissance of your area for the next 30 minutes. If you happen to be in a position where you could grab onto something during that reconnaissance, that would be purely coincidental." Tank smiled grimly as he understood what she was proposing. "Ghost, we copy. We'll be ready for your reconnaissance mission." What Sarah did next would become legend in close air support circles. She brought her A-10 down to an altitude that was technically unsafe, flying slow enough and low enough that Alpha Team could grab onto the external weapon pylons of her aircraft. It was dangerous, it was unauthorized, and it was completely insane. It was also their only chance of survival. One by one, Alpha Team grabbed onto the aircraft and held on as Sarah climbed away from the compound. The flight back to a safe area lasted only 10 minutes, but it was the longest 10 minutes of their lives. When they finally reached friendly territory and Sarah was able to land, Tank and his team were battered, exhausted, and traumatized by what they had experienced. But they were alive, and they had evidence that would expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the American military. Thompson's communication equipment had been recording everything, including his own admission of treason and the details of the operation designed to prolong the war in Afghanistan. The evidence they had gathered would ultimately lead to dozens of arrests and a complete reorganization of military contracting oversight. But the most important outcome was that 4 American soldiers had refused to give up, had refused to accept that their own government would sacrifice them for political gain. With the help of a pilot who was willing to risk everything to do the right thing, they had exposed a conspiracy and lived to tell about it. As Tank looked at his team, he realized that their real mission had just begun. They had survived the betrayal, but now they had to survive the aftermath. And that might be even more dangerous than the mountains of Afghanistan. 6 months later, Tank Williams sat in a secure conference room in the Pentagon, facing a panel of investigators who had been working around the clock to unravel the conspiracy that had nearly cost him and his team their lives. The evidence they had gathered in Afghanistan had opened a door into a world of corruption that reached deeper into the military-industrial complex than anyone had imagined. Chief Williams, can you describe the moment you realized that American personnel were actively working to eliminate your team? Asked Senator Margaret Hayes, who was chairing the congressional investigation. Tank looked around the room at the faces of politicians, military officers, and investigators who were trying to understand something that still seemed impossible to him. "Senator, I think we knew something was wrong from the beginning, but we kept believing the system would work. We kept thinking that if we followed procedures and trusted our command structure, everything would work out. When did that change?" Senator Hayes asked, when Colonel Thompson smiled at me after shooting at me with a U.S. military-issued sidearm while coordinating with Taliban forces to kill American soldiers. At that point, the evidence became pretty clear. The investigation had revealed that the conspiracy involved over 40 military officers, dozens of defense contractors, and several high-ranking officials in the Department of Defense. The operation to eliminate Alpha Team had been just one small part of a larger scheme to manipulate intelligence, prolong conflicts, and generate profits for a network of companies that had been bleeding the American taxpayer for years. Colonel Bradley Thompson had been the key figure in the operation, using his position in Army intelligence to coordinate between American defense contractors and various insurgent groups in Afghanistan. The goal had been to maintain a level of conflict that would justify continued military spending while avoiding the kind of decisive victory that would end the profitable war. Alpha Team's mission had been compromised from the beginning because their success would have provided intelligence that could have led to a major breakthrough in peace negotiations. Thompson and his co-conspirators couldn't allow that to happen, so they had arranged for the team to be eliminated in a way that would look like a tactical failure rather than deliberate sabotage. Chief Williams, how do you feel about Major Patterson's actions during this operation? Senator Hayes asked. Tank's face showed the first emotion he had displayed during hours of testimony. Senator, Major Sarah Patterson saved 4 American lives by choosing to do what was right instead of what was easy. She risked her career, her freedom, and her life to protect soldiers she had never met. In my opinion, she represents the very best of what the American military is supposed to be. Sarah Patterson was sitting in the witness section of the hearing room, wearing her dress blue uniform with new rank insignia. The investigation had not only cleared her of all charges, but had resulted in her promotion to lieutenant colonel. She had become a symbol of military integrity and had been assigned to a new position overseeing close air support operations for Special Forces units. But the recognition came with a price. Sarah had received death threats from people connected to the conspiracy, and her family had been placed under federal protection. The people she had helped expose were powerful and well-connected, and they weren't giving up without a fight. Morrison, Rodriguez, and Chen were also in the hearing room, having testified about their experiences over the past several days. The investigation had been thorough and sometimes brutal, forcing them to relive the trauma of being abandoned by their own command structure and hunted by people wearing American uniforms. Chen had discovered during the investigation that her expertise in signals intelligence had made her a particular target. The conspiracy had been using compromised communication systems to coordinate their operations, and her ability to intercept and analyze those communications posed a direct threat to their security. Rodriguez had learned that his GPS equipment had been deliberately sabotaged before the mission, causing the navigational errors that had put them in the wrong place at the wrong time. The sabotage had been subtle and sophisticated, designed to look like equipment failure rather than deliberate manipulation. Morrison's sniper skills had made him a priority target because his ability to provide long-range reconnaissance could have identified the conspiracy much earlier if he had been allowed to observe the right targets. The committee would like to understand how this conspiracy was able to operate for so long without detection, Senator Hayes said, addressing the panel of investigators. Deputy Secretary of Defense Michael Harper, who had led the investigation, stood to address the committee. Senator, the conspiracy was successful because it operated within the normal bureaucratic processes of the military. Orders were issued through legitimate channels, personnel assignments were made through standard procedures, and operations were conducted using authorized equipment and resources. But surely there were warning signs? There were, but they were dismissed as operational friction or attributed to the fog of war. The people involved in this conspiracy were highly trained military professionals who understood how to manipulate the system from the inside. Tank listened to the testimony with a mixture of satisfaction and anger. Justice was being served, but the cost had been enormous. Dozens of American soldiers had died in operations that had been deliberately sabotaged, and countless resources had been wasted on missions designed to fail. The hearing continued for several more hours, covering technical details about communication intercepts, financial records, and the complex web of relationships that had made the conspiracy possible. But for Tank, the most important moment came when Senator Hayes asked her final question. Chief Williams, what lessons should the American people learn from this experience? Tank thought carefully before responding. Senator, I think the most important lesson is that the system only works when good people are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it costs them everything. Major Patterson could have followed orders and let us die. She chose to risk her career to save American lives. And what about your team's decision to go on the offensive instead of waiting for rescue? Sometimes you can't wait for someone else to do the right thing. Sometimes you have to take action yourself, even when you don't have official authorization or support. Tank's words resonated throughout the hearing room and, when broadcast on television later that day, throughout the country. The story of Alpha Team and Ghost had captured the public imagination in a way that few military stories ever did. It wasn't just a story about heroism in combat. It was a story about ordinary people facing an impossible situation and choosing to fight for their principles instead of accepting defeat. It was a reminder that the military's strength came not from its weapons or its technology, but from the character of the people who served. In the months that followed the hearings, significant changes were made to military contracting procedures, communication security protocols, and oversight mechanisms. The conspiracy that had targeted Alpha Team led to reforms that strengthened the entire defense establishment. But for Tank and his team, the real victory wasn't in the policy changes or the criminal convictions. It was in the knowledge that they had faced the worst that human nature could offer and had refused to surrender their integrity. A year after the events in Afghanistan, Alpha Team was reunited at a ceremony where they received the Medal of Honor for their actions. Sarah Patterson received the Air Force Cross for her role in their rescue. The ceremony was held at the White House, with the president personally presenting the awards. During his speech, the president said, "These 5 individuals remind us that our military's greatest strength lies not in its technology or its firepower, but in the courage and character of the men and women who wear the uniform. When the system failed them, they didn't fail each other." After the ceremony, Tank and Sarah found themselves standing together on the White House lawn, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "You know," Sarah said, "when I first heard your team calling for help, I never imagined it would lead to all this." Tank smiled. "When we first heard your voice on the radio, we thought you were just another pilot following orders. We never imagined you'd be willing to throw away your career to save 4 strangers." "We weren't strangers," Sarah replied. "We were Americans, and Americans don't abandon each other." Tank nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Ghost, I've been thinking about something. The people we exposed, they're probably not the only ones. There are probably other conspiracies, other soldiers in danger, other situations where the system is being used against the people it's supposed to protect." Sarah's expression grew serious. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe our mission isn't over. Maybe there's more work to be done." 6 months later, a new unit was quietly established within the Department of Defense. Officially, it was called the Special Operations Integrity Office. Unofficially, it was known as Ghost Team. The unit's mission was to investigate situations where American military personnel might be endangered by corruption or conspiracy within their own command structure. Tank Williams was appointed as the unit's commanding officer, with Sarah Patterson as his deputy. Their first case involved a Marine unit in Syria that had been reporting unusual resistance to what should have been routine patrols. The communications patterns were similar to what Alpha Team had experienced in Afghanistan, and the no-fly orders were being issued through the same channels that had been used to isolate Tank's team. As Tank prepared to deploy his new team to Syria, he thought about the lessons they had learned in Afghanistan. They had discovered that corruption could exist anywhere, that good people sometimes had to break bad rules, and that the most important battles were often fought not against foreign enemies, but against the enemies within their own system. But they had also learned that courage was contagious, that people were willing to do the right thing when they saw others taking that risk, and that the truth had a power that no conspiracy could ultimately defeat. The radio call sign Ghost had become a symbol throughout the military, representing the idea that help could come from unexpected places, that someone was always watching out for soldiers in danger, and that the system could be made to work when good people were willing to fight for it. Tank keyed his radio as his aircraft lifted off for Syria. "Ghost Team, this is actual. Mission is a go. Let's go find some Americans who need our help." In the years that followed, Ghost Team would investigate dozens of cases, expose multiple conspiracies, and save countless American lives. They would become a legend within the special operations community, a reminder that the price of freedom was eternal vigilance, not just against foreign enemies, but against those who would corrupt the system from within. The story of Alpha Team and Ghost had become more than just a tale of survival against impossible odds. It had become a symbol of what was possible when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things, when they refused to accept that betrayal was inevitable, and when they were willing to risk everything to protect the values they had sworn to defend. In the end, that was the real victory, not the medals or the recognition or the policy changes, but the knowledge that when the system failed, the people within it had the courage to make it work again. And that was a lesson that would endure long after the last shots had been fired and the last conspirators had been brought to justice. The Ghost would always be watching, and American soldiers would never be truly abandoned as long as people like Tank Williams and Sarah Patterson were willing to answer the call.